They did not expect this. When Soviet soldiers first laid eyes on American trucks rolling through mud, snow, and shattered roads, many of them simply stopped and stared. These were not tanks or weapons meant to intimidate an enemy. They were something far more unsettling. Machines that worked, radios that didn't fail, engines that started in freezing temperatures, where Soviet and German vehicles alike had already surrendered to the cold. For men who had survived the chaos of 1941, this was not just equipment. It was a revelation, and it would quietly change how the Soviet Union understood modern war. To understand why this moment mattered, we must go back to the darkest days of the Second World War on the Eastern Front, when the German invasion of the Soviet Union unleashed destruction on a scale the world had never seen. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa shattered the Red Army. Entire formations collapsed in weeks. Millions of Soviet soldiers were killed or captured. German armored columns advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, cutting supply lines and encircling vast numbers of troops. But amid this catastrophe, something unexpected happened. Tens, possibly hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers did not surrender. They disappeared, cut off from command, surrounded by enemy forces, with no clear path back to friendly lines. They vanished into the forests, swamps, and villages of occupied territory. These men did not set out to become guerrillas or freedom fighters. Most of them were simply trying to survive. But survival behind enemy lines meant fighting differently. Conventional warfare had collapsed. What emerged instead was a shadow war, irregular, brutal, and deeply misunderstood. A war fought without uniforms, without front lines, and often without mercy. Partisan warfare was not new to Russian history. The memory of Napoleon's invasion in 1812 still lingered in national myth. When Russian irregulars harassed French supply lines and weakened an invading army that could not feed itself. Similar fears haunted German planners in both world wars. But by 1941, the Soviet leadership had largely moved away from planning for irregular warfare. The purges of the late 1930s had eliminated many officers who understood such tactics, and the Red Army had refocused on conventional operations. When the Germans invaded, there was no grand partisan strategy waiting to be unleashed. Instead, the partisan movement emerged organically from disaster. The geography of the Western Soviet Union made this possible. Vast forests stretched across Belarus and Western Russia. Swamps swallowed roads and vehicles. Rail lines were few, and roads were primitive. This terrain was a nightmare for an occupying army, but a refuge for those who knew how to hide. German forces pushed eastward with speed, but they did not have the manpower to secure everything behind them. Supply lines became lifelines and vulnerabilities. Former Red Army soldiers began to organize. Officers imposed discipline. Units formed around experience rather than ideology. Civilians joined, sometimes out of patriotism, often out of desperation, driven by the harsh realities of German occupation. What began as scattered bands slowly evolved into something far more dangerous for the occupiers. But partisan warfare existed in a legal and moral gray zone. International law, shaped by conventions in The Hague before the First World War, recognized combatants only if they met specific criteria: clear command structures, identifiable insignia, weapons carried openly, and adherence to the laws of war. Partisans rarely met all these conditions. For the Germans, this became justification. Captured partisans were often denied prisoner of war status. Reprisals followed attacks. Villages were burned. Civilians executed. What was framed as security warfare became a campaign of terror. By 1942, however, Moscow recognized the potential of this hidden battlefield. The Soviet state moved to bring order to chaos. Command structures were formalized. Liaison officers coordinated operations. Supply drops arrived by night. Weapons, explosives, and radios parachuted into the forests. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival transformed into a strategic weapon. German rail traffic suffered enormously. Bridges were destroyed. Trains derailed. Communications cut. Entire German divisions were pulled away from the front not to fight tanks or infantry, but to hunt invisible enemies in endless forests. The Eastern Front was bleeding far behind the lines. It was during this phase of the war that American technology quietly entered the story. Through the Lend-Lease program, the United States supplied the Soviet Union with vast quantities of equipment. While tanks and aircraft drew headlines, it was the less glamorous items that made the difference. Trucks, radios, fuel, boots, food, the unglamorous foundations of modern warfare. American trucks, especially Studebakers, became legendary. They were reliable, easy to maintain, and capable of operating in terrain that defeated other vehicles. Soviet soldiers noticed. Soviet officers remembered. For partisan units operating deep behind enemy lines, these supplies were transformative. Radios allowed coordination across vast distances. Mobility meant the difference between escape and annihilation. Food meant survival through brutal winters. American industrial output did not fight the war directly in the forests, but it enabled those who did. Many Soviet veterans later admitted something remarkable. They did not merely appreciate American aid. They were impressed by it. The sheer scale, reliability, and efficiency of American production left a lasting impression on men who had witnessed the collapse of their own logistics in 1941. War, they learned, was not only about courage or ideology. It was about systems. The German response grew increasingly violent. Anti-partisan operations escalated into mass reprisals. Entire regions were pacified through terror. On the Eastern Front, the distinction between military necessity and ideological annihilation disappeared. The Germans did not simply seek to defeat partisans. They sought to eradicate the populations that sustained them. This brutality, in turn, drove more civilians into resistance, creating a vicious cycle with no escape. By 1944, the impact of the partisan war was undeniable. German logistics were collapsing under constant attack. Frontline units suffered shortages of fuel and ammunition. Rail networks in key regions were effectively paralyzed. The Red Army's advances were eased not only by direct battlefield victories, but by the unseen war that had weakened the enemy from within. The partisan war did not win World War II on its own, but without it, the German war effort on the Eastern Front might have lasted far longer. And beneath it all lay a quieter lesson, one that would shape the post-war world. Soviet leaders and soldiers alike had seen American industrial power up close. They had seen what it meant to mobilize an entire economy for war. That lesson did not disappear in 1945. It carried into the Cold War, into missile programs, proxy wars, and decades of strategic rivalry defined not only by ideology, but by production, logistics, and technology. World War II was not decided only in massive tank battles or iconic invasions. It was decided in forests, on rail lines, and in factories thousands of miles away. And the echoes of that hidden war still shape our world today.